Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. Today we will be looking at the escalating tensions going on between America and the European powers. Hear James Madison's 1810 State of the Union address to Congress in full, and look into a change that's going on in West Florida. Welcome to 1810 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, meaning it's also New Year's Day in Russia, where John Quincy Adams, who has become the first U.S. minister to Russia, writes, "I close the year with sentiments of gratitude to heaven for the blessings and preservations which my family and myself have experienced in its course. It has witnessed another great change in my condition, brought me to face new trials, dangers, and temptations, relieving me from many of those in which I was before involved. It has also changed the nature of my obligations and duties, and required the exertion of other virtues and the suppression of other passions. From this new conflict, may the favor of heaven continue its assistance, to issue pure and victorious as from the past. May it enable me better to discharge all my social duties, and to serve my country and my fellow men with zeal, fidelity, and effect, imploring the blessings of God upon my family, present and absent, upon my wife and children, my parents, my kindred friends, and country. I look with trembling hope at the mingled light and shade of futurity, and pass to a new year with the fervent prayer for firmness to perform, as well as prudence to discern my duty, and for temper and fortitude to meet every possible variety of events." John Quincy Adams, the son of America's second president, John Adams, will remain in Russia, specifically St. Petersburg, for years more, and will soon be present to witness Napoleon's failed invasion of the country. Now, on to some American events. Madison writes to Congress on January the 3rd, saying, "The act authorizing a detachment of 100,000 men from the militia will expire on the 30th of March next. Its early revival is recommended, in order that timely steps may be taken for arrangements such as the act contemplated, without interfering with the modifications rendered necessary by the defects, or the inefficacy of the laws restrictive of commerce and navigation, or with the policy of disallowing to foreign armed vessels the use of our waters. It falls within my duty to recommend also that, in addition to the precautionary measure authorized by that act, and to the regular troops for completing the legal establishment of which enlistments are renewed, every necessary provision may be made for a volunteer force of 20,000 men to be enlisted for a short period and held in a state of organization and readiness for actual service at the shortest warning. I submit to the consideration of Congress, moreover, the expediency of such a classification and organization of the militia as will best ensure prompt and successive aids from that source adequate to emergencies which may call for them. It will rest with them also to determine how far further provision may be expedient for putting into actual service, if necessary, any part of the naval armament not now employed. At a period presenting features in the conduct of foreign powers towards the United States which impose on them the necessity of precautionary measures involving expense, it is a happy consideration that such is the solid state of the public credit, that reliance may be justly placed on any legal provision that may be made for resorting to it in a convenient form and to an adequate amount. So, Madison is looking to increase the amount of military force that the United States is able to muster, and muster quickly. The obvious reason for this is the increasing conflict between the United States and the European powers, particularly Great Britain. On that subject, on May 1st of this year, Macon's Bill No. 2 becomes law, intending to motivate Britain and France to stop seizing American vessels during the Napoleonic Wars. This being a further change to foreign policy. The fourth, made in a series of different embargo measures coming after the Non-Importation Act, the Embargo Act, and the Non-Intercourse Act, which we just covered last year. Its unique name, Macon's Bill No. 2, comes from the fact that it is a revised version of a bill proposed by Representative Nathaniel Macon, though Macon actually does not write this bill nor approve it. It is designed as a way to motivate the European powers to stop intercepting American ships by stating that if either belligerent ceases intercepting American shipping, that the United States will embargo the other, unless that country also agrees to cease intercepting American shipping. While in earnest and somewhat inventive attempt to keep Americans safe, Napoleon exploits the bill. A message is sent to the United States purporting to agree to the law's demand, and President James Madison, a staunch opponent of the bill, has little choice but to accept Napoleon's ostensibly sincere offer. Soon, though, as Madison had suspected would be the case, Napoleon's purpose is proved to be manipulative. When Britain threatens to impose punitive measures on the United States in response to the singular embargo they are going to be receiving, Napoleon reneges anyway, having achieved his goal of pushing the United States and Britain closer to all-out war. On June 4th, 13 men meet at Marsh's Tavern on Court Street in Dedham, Massachusetts to form the Society in Dedham for Apprehending Horse Thieves. The stated reason for forming this organization is described as, quote, "The great number of horses stolen from amongst us and in our vicinity is truly alarming, and calls for the attention of every well-disposed citizen. It is evident that there has been, and probably will continue, a combination of villains through the northern states to carry into effect this malignant design, and their frequent escape from the hand of justice stimulates them to that atrocious practice. And as that kind of property is most liable to be carried out of our knowledge, it requires the utmost exertion of every good member of society to baffle and suppress depredations of this kind." I bring it up as not only does the society have an interesting history and a rather funny habit of sending certificates to notables and elites as a joke, counting amongst its ranks today more than 10,000 members, including heads of state, Supreme Court justices, governors, popes, professors, and generals, but I really bring it up as a way to discuss early law enforcement in the United States. Now, for starters, there are no police forces in the US, at least not in any recognizable fashion. No uniformed officers, no centralized command, and no regular patrol duties. Crimes and misdemeanors, when they do occur, are handled through a rudimentary patchwork of laws that date back to the colonial period and really to English common law. It's hard to, from our modern perspective, understand just how tight-knit many of the small towns throughout the United States are at this time, and as a community generally relies on the citizenry functioning together, there is a great importance placed on getting along with and benefiting and looking out for one's neighbors. As such, property crimes are pretty rare and usually committed by outsiders to any particular community. Watchmen serving in rotation or on a volunteer basis, or operating as hired security, may guard a town or village at night, but during the day, citizens largely look out for each other. In some towns of considerable size, constables serve as needed to serve court summons, arrest accused offenders, and collect fines. In rural areas, local sheriffs carry out largely the same function and are able to deputize men in their area if needed, as the remote hamlets and villages sometimes need a larger band of defenders or pursuing parties. Still, in other areas, especially Western territories, there may be no form of law enforcement present besides the citizenry full stop. Serious crimes such as murder, arson, major theft, and rape would often lead to mobs pursuing and apprehending the perpetrator or suspected perpetrator. As obviously there is no photo evidence, no taking of fingerprints, and rarely any real form of physical evidence at all, most court cases rely on the testimony of victims of crimes in order to try the accused, and eyewitnesses to corroborate the claims. In hubs of commerce or port cities, customs inspectors and harbor patrols ensure orderly conducting of business, and as the importation of slavery is now outlawed, they enforce the prohibition on that practice as well. Paramilitary groups are often seen in areas with high slave populations ready to respond to runaway slaves or to quell uprisings, and of course the militia of each state can be mustered for large-scale events requiring numbers to restore peace and order. All of that is accepting the actual United States military. We're talking purely the citizen law enforcement system. Amidst this backdrop, it really makes sense that some skilled riders are ready to chase down horse thieves, and while there's only one recorded instance of a successful reclaiming of a stolen horse by the Society in Dedham for Apprehending Horse Thieves, that's at least one family who has not been deprived of their property. Now, on the 23rd of June, John Jacob Astor forms the Pacific Fur Company. We first mentioned Astor a few years ago, but with the western expansion now authorized, the Tonkin soon set sail from New York Harbor with 33 employees of the newly created company on board. And after a 6-month journey around the tip of South America, the ship will arrive at the mouth of the Columbia River, and Astor's men begin the work to build a fur trading post of Fort Astoria about 5 miles in from the coast. That fort being why Astoria, Oregon is now named as such. This becomes the first American-owned settlement on the Pacific coast, and while construction is not completed until 1811, the fort will come up again next week. As it will be increasingly relevant, we'll look into the now iconic Indian chief Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa. At a young age, Tecumseh's father was killed in a battle with the Americans, and Tecumseh had notably joined Chief Blue Jacket in the Battle of Fallen Timbers, so he has seen frontier violence firsthand. The defeat of the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, of course, did not end Indian resistance to U.S. expansion, but it did lead to the Treaty of Greenville, which at least temporarily ended the threat of an Indian confederation, which by then had grown to encompass 30 tribes. Filling the void left by the weakened Indian Confederacy, some years ago, Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa began a pseudo-religious movement calling on Indians from all tribes to unite in order to reject the Americans' way of life and resist their expansion. As such, Tenskwatawa became known as the Prophet. In 1808, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa founded a multi-tribal village referred to as Prophetstown, and Tecumseh has since been traveling around to various tribes to spread his brother's message. Tecumseh urges tribes not to cede more territory unless all agree, and this obviously alarms the Americans and reportedly even some tribal leaders who see at least limited capitulation as the surest means to their people's continued survival. William Henry Harrison, who is currently the governor of the Indiana Territory, though that's far from the most notable position that he'll hold, has inlaid spies into various tribes and receives word that a resistance movement is taking shape and sends a letter to Tecumseh saying, "Our bluecoats are more numerous than you can count, and our hunting shirts are like the leaves of the forest. or the grains of sand on the Wabash. That mostly catches us up to today, when 400 Indians under the leadership of Tecumseh arrive at Vincennes, and the leaders are escorted to Grouseland, the governor's home, where they meet with Harrison. Reportedly, Tecumseh tells the governor that any further incursions into Indian lands will mean war, and Harrison insists that the land has been acquired legally. Tecumseh begins shouting at the governor, saying that he's a liar, and as things escalate, war clubs are drawn, pistols are cocked, and for a few seconds both sides stare one another down. The tense moment doesn't escalate further, and eventually Tecumseh and his men head out, leaving their hope for a peaceful resolution behind. There's an interesting dynamic here, as it's widely reported that Tecumseh could have easily killed not just William Henry Harrison here, but likely pretty effectively killed the entire town, consisting of only about 1,000 Americans. But Tecumseh is aware that an act such as killing the American governor will swiftly bring the entire force of the United States down on the tribes that he's representing, and there's little to be done for the moment. It's hoped by Tecumseh that active resistance to further land claims and guerrilla attacks in the meantime can push the Americans back before he amasses enough to go to an actual war. We'll see the effects of the growing tensions next year as America continues to prepare itself for conflict on nearly every front. Now, beginning a story that will carry us into next year, we need to get some context on Florida. Florida was for some time divided into West and East Florida, with Britain possessing the East. However, after the treaty in '83, Spain reclaimed East Florida, though the designation remains. Over the last several decades, the population, however, of West Florida has become largely Anglo-American. And over this year's summer, West Floridians held a series of conventions around St. Francisville to consider their options. Things get complicated when on September 23rd, about 50 to 75 militiamen, it's amazing that sometimes that's all it takes, are led by Philemon Thomas to seize Fort San Carlos at Baton Rouge, which is currently the main Spanish post in West Florida. Just 3 days later, delegates declare independence, draft a constitution calling their government the State of Florida, and soon choose former U.S. diplomat Fulwar Skipwith as governor. A flag is created, simply a blue field with a single 5-point star centered upright in the middle, and this, as well as other flags like it, eventually become known as Bonnie Blue flags. President James Madison refuses to recognize this newly declared independent republic, and instead, on October 27th, he proclaims the Baton Rouge district is part of the Louisiana Purchase and orders Governor William C.C. Claiborne of the Orleans Territory to take possession of it, which he does quickly and without a general fight. Now, some theorize that Madison had actually encouraged the revolution in West Florida and even selected his political ally, Fulwar Skipwith, to lead the state before claiming the area for America. I have found nothing that would definitively show this to be the case. Tying this back into Madison's defense program that was requested at the start of the year, however, there is a quiet but firm preparation taking place to defend U.S. interests on the frontiers, both on the Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes, without any premature declaration of war. And having control of this key portion of the coast and the port city of Baton Rouge proves to be an important acquisition. But it's also likely Madison moved on West Florida to prevent Britain from trying to. In the end, Spain and Great Britain are at this point too occupied with war in Europe to contest the American action, though Madison's actions are controversial in the United States, as he has technically just sent military forces into the territory of a friendly nation without the consent of Congress, something Federalists call an unprovoked act of war. Madison makes the claim that he, in reality, only liberated a tract of land technically granted to the United States already in the Louisiana Purchase. And without getting too far ahead of myself, I will just say that that claim is the source of much contention that we'll cover at the beginning of next year. With it being a year that ends in 0, another census is due to be taken. This census of 1810 is the third ever taken in the United States and returns a total count of 7,239,881 people living in the country, 1,191,362 of them found to be slaves. A couple fast facts about this census is that this is the final census in which Virginia will be the most populous state, soon to be superseded by New York. Virginia's ranking at number 1 is granted because of its population count of 983,152, with New York close on its tail at 959,049. The third most populous state is Pennsylvania at 810,091 residents. Now I'll give you just a moment if you'd like to pause and guess what you think the 5 most populated cities are in the year 1810. Alright, New York unsurprisingly comes in at number 1 with a population of 96,373. Philadelphia is the second most at 53,722. Baltimore in Maryland is at number 3 with a population of 46,555. And number 5 is Charleston, South Carolina, with a population of 24,711 residents. The city of Washington in the District of Columbia currently has a population of 8,208 residents, and always interesting when you see a big city now with such a small population, but all the way down the list you'll find Nashville in Tennessee with a population of just 2,490 residents. On December 10th, James Madison makes a State of the Union address, which we'll cover now.
Fellow citizens of the Senate and House of Representatives, the embarrassments which have prevailed in our foreign relations and so much employed the deliberations of Congress make it a primary duty in meeting you to communicate whatever may have occurred in that branch of our national affairs. The act of the last session of Congress concerning the commercial intercourse between the United States and Great Britain and France and their dependencies, having invited in a new form a termination of their edicts against our neutral commerce, copies of the act were immediately forwarded to our ministers at London and Paris with a view that its object might be within the early attention of the French and British governments. By the communication received through our minister at Paris, it appeared that knowledge of the act by the French government was followed by a declaration that the Berlin and Milan decrees were revoked and would cease to have an effect on the first day of November ensuing. These being the only known edicts of France within the description of the act, and the revocation of them being such that they ceased at that date to violate our neutral commerce, the fact, as prescribed by law, was announced by a proclamation bearing date the 2nd of November. It would have well accorded with the conciliatory views indicated by this proceeding on the part of France to have extended them to all the grounds of just complaint which now remain unadjusted with the United States. It was particularly anticipated that as a further evidence of just dispositions toward them, restoration would have been immediately made of the property of our citizens, under a misapplication of the principle of reprisals combined with a misconstruction of a law of the United States. This expectation has not been fulfilled. From the British government, no communication on the subject of the act has been received. To a communication from our minister at London, of a revocation by the French government of its Berlin and Milan decrees, it was answered that the British system would be relinquished as soon as the repeal of the French decrees should have actually taken effect and the commerce of neutral nations have been restored to the condition in which it stood previously to the promulgation of those decrees. This pledge, although it does not necessarily import, does not exclude the intention of relinquishing, along with the others in council, the practice of those novel blockades which have a like effect of interrupting our neutral commerce, and this further justice to the United States is the rather to be looked for, inasmuch as the blockades in question, being not more contrary to the established law of nations than inconsistent with the rules of blockade formally recognized by Great Britain herself, could have no alleged basis other than the plea of retaliation alleged as the basis of the orders in council. Under the modification of the original orders of November 1807 into the orders of April 1809, there is indeed scarcely a nominal distinction between the orders and the blockades. One of those illegitimate blockades bearing date in May 1806, having been expressly avowed to be still unrescinded, and to be in effect comprehended in the orders in council, was too distinctly brought within the purview of the Act of Congress, not to be comprehended in the explanation of the requisites to a compliance with it. The British government was accordingly apprised by our minister near it that such was the light in which the subject was to be regarded. On the other important subjects depending between the United States and the government, no progress has been made from which an early and satisfactory result can be relied on. In this new posture of our relations with those powers, the consideration of Congress will be properly turned to a removal of doubts which may occur in the exposition and of difficulties in the execution of the act above cited. The commerce of the United States with the north of Europe, heretofore much vexed by licentious cruisers particularly under the Danish flag, has latterly been visited with fresh and extensive depredations. The measures pursued in behalf of our injured citizens not having obtained justice for them, a further and more formal interposition with the Danish government is contemplated. The principles which have been maintained by that government in relation to neutral commerce and the friendly professions of His Danish Majesty toward the United States are valuable pledges in favor of a successful issue. Among the events growing out of the state of the Spanish monarchy, our attention was imperiously attracted to the change developing itself in that portion of West Florida which, though of right appertaining to the United States, had remained in the possession of Spain, awaiting the result of negotiations for its actual delivery to them. The Spanish authority was subverted and a situation produced, exposing the country to ulterior events which might essentially affect the rights and welfare of the Union. In such a conjuncture, I did not delay the interposition required for the occupancy of the territories west of the River Perdido, to which the title of the United States extends, and to which the laws provided for the territory of Orleans are applicable. With this view, the proclamation of which a copy is laid before you, was confided to the governor of that territory to be carried into effect. The legality and necessity of the course pursued assure me of the favorable light in which it will present itself to the legislature, and of the promptitude with which they will supply whatever provisions may be due to the essential rights and equitable interests of the people thus brought into the bosom of the American family. Our amity with the powers of Barbary, with the exception of a recent occurrence at Tunis, of which an explanation is just received, appears to have been uninterrupted and to have become more firmly established. With the Indian tribes, also the peace and friendship of the United States are found to be so eligible that the general disposition to preserve both continues to gain strength. I feel particular satisfaction in remarking that an interior view of our country presents us with grateful proofs of its substantial and increasing prosperity. To a thriving agriculture and the improvements related to it is added a highly interesting extension of useful manufacturers, the combined product of professional occupations and of household industry. Such indeed is the experience of economy as well as of policy in these substitutes for supplies heretofore obtained by foreign commerce that in a national view the change is justly regarded as of itself more than a recompense for those privations and losses resulting from foreign injustice which furnished the general impulse required for its accomplishment. How far it may be expedient to guard the infancy of this improvement in the distribution of labor by regulations of the commercial tariff is a subject which cannot fail to suggest itself to your patriotic reflections. It will rest with the consideration of Congress also whether a provident as well as a fair encouragement would not be given to our navigation by such regulations as would place it on a level of competition with foreign vessels, particularly in transporting the important and bulky productions of our own soil. The failure of equality and reciprocity in the existing regulations on this subject operates in our ports as a premium to foreign competitors, and the inconvenience must increase as these may be multiplied under more favorable circumstances, by more than countervailing encouragements now given them by the laws of their respective countries. Whilst it is universally admitted that a well-instructed people alone can be permanently a free people, and whilst it is evident that the means of diffusing and improving useful knowledge form so small a proportion of the expenditures for national purposes, I cannot presume it to be unreasonable to invite your attention to the advantages of superadding to the means of education provided by the several states a seminary of learning instituted by the national legislature within the limits of their exclusive jurisdiction, the expense of which might be defrayed or reimbursed out of the vacant grounds which have accrued to the nation within those limits. Such an institution, though local in its legal character, would be universal in its beneficial effects. By enlightening the opinions, by expanding the patriotism, and by assimilating the principles, the sentiments, and the manners of those who might resort to this temple of science, to be redistributed in due time through every part of the community, sources of jealousy and prejudice would be diminished, the features of national character would be multiplied, and greater extent given to social harmony. But above all, a well-constituted seminary in the center of the nation is recommended by the consideration that the additional instruction emanating from it would contribute not less to strengthen the foundations than to adorn the structure of our free and happy system of government. Among the commercial abuses still committed under the American flag, and leaving in force my former reference to that subject, it appears that American citizens are instrumental in carrying on a traffic in enslaved Africans, equally in violation of the laws of humanity and in defiance of those of their own country. The same just and benevolent motives which produced interdiction in force against this criminal conduct will doubtless be felt by Congress in devising further means of suppressing the evil. In the midst of uncertainties necessarily connected with the great interests of the United States, prudence requires a continuance of our defensive and precautionary arrangement. The Secretary of War and Secretary of the Navy will submit the statements and estimates which may aid Congress in their ensuing provisions for the land and naval forces. The statements of the latter will include a view of the transfers of appropriations in the naval expenditures and in the grounds on which they were made. The fortifications for the defense of our maritime frontier have been prosecuted according to the plan laid down in 1808. The works, with some exceptions, are completed and furnished with ordnance. Those for the security of the city of New York, though far advanced toward completion, will require a further time and appropriation. This is the case with a few others either not completed or in need of repairs. The improvements in quality and quantity made in the manufacture of cannon and small arms, both at the public armories and private factories, warrant additional confidence in the competency of these resources for supplying the public exigencies. These preparations for arming the militia, having thus far provided for one of the objects contemplated by the power vested in Congress with respect to that great bulwark of the public safety, it is for their consideration whether further provisions are not requisite for the other contemplated objects of organization and discipline. To give to this great mass of physical and moral force the efficiency which it merits and is capable of receiving, it is indispensable that they should be instructed and practiced in the rules by which they are to be governed. Toward an accomplishment of this important work, I recommend for the consideration of Congress the expediency of instituting a system which shall in the first instance call into the field at the public expense, and for a given time, certain portions of the commissioned and non-commissioned officers. The instruction and discipline thus acquired would gradually diffuse through the entire body of the militia that practical knowledge and promptitude for active service which are the great ends to be pursued. Experience has left no doubt either of the necessity or of the efficacy of competent military skill in those portions of an army in fitting it for the final duties which it may have to perform. The Corps of Engineers, with the Military Academy, are entitled to the early attention of Congress. The buildings at the seat fixed by law for the present Academy are so far in decay as not to afford the necessary accommodation. But a revision of the law is recommended, principally with a view toward a more enlarged cultivation and diffusion of the advantages of such institutions by providing professorships for all the necessary branches of military instruction, and by the establishment of an additional academy at the seat of government or elsewhere. The means by which war, as well as for defense, as for offense, are now carried on, render these schools of the more scientific operations an indispensable part of every adequate system. Even among nations whose large standing armies and frequent wars afford every other opportunity of instruction, these establishments are found to be indispensable for the due attainment of the branches of military science which require a regular course of study and experiment. In a government happily without the other opportunities, seminaries where the elementary principles of the art of war can be taught without actual war, and without the expense of extensive and standing armies, have the precious advantage of uniting an essential preparation against external danger with a scrupulous regard to internal safety. In no other way, probably, can a provision of equal efficacy for the public defense be made at so little expense or more consistently with the public liberty. The receipts into the Treasury during the year ending on the 30th of September last, and amounting to more than 8.5 millions, have exceeded the current expenses of the government, including the interest on the public debt. For the purpose of reimbursing at the end of the year 3.75 millions of the principal, a loan as authorized by law had been negotiated to that amount, but has since been reduced to 2.75 millions, the reduction being permitted by the state of the Treasury, in which there will be a balance remaining at the end of the year, estimated at 2 millions. For the probable receipts of the next year and other details, I refer to statements which will be transmitted from the Treasury, and which will enable you to judge what further provisions may be necessary for the ensuing years. Reserving for future occasions in the course of the session whatever other communications may claim your attention, I close the present by expressing my reliance, under the blessing of divine providence, on the judgment and patriotism which will guide your measures, at a period particularly calling for united counsels and flexible exertions for the welfare of our country, and by assuring you of the fidelity and alacrity with which my cooperation will be afforded.
Alright, that's really all we got for this year. It's a little bit lighter, but I promise to make it up for you with tomorrow's episode and everything that comes out next week. Until then, If you are enjoying the show, give it a review or a comment on whatever platform you're on. Share the show with somebody that you know that may enjoy it, and we'll see you in 1811. This has been Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening.